Hi, I'm Hayley and welcome to the next in our Rhythm for Life series. If you've been following along with us, you will know that we have been studying together the book of Ruth. And this video marks the very last in our Ruth series as we've come now to the end of Bible month. And so I'm just going to read a very small portion from Ruth chapter 4, reading from verse 18. Now these are the generations of Perez. Perez fathered Hezron. Hezron fathered Ram. Ram fathered Amminadab. Amminadab fathered Nahshon. Nahshon fathered Salmon. Salmon fathered Boaz. Boaz fathered Obed. Obed fathered Jesse. And Jesse fathered David. And it is with this genealogy that the book of Ruth concludes, starting with Perez and finishing with David. As we look back on Bible month, I wonder how you have found it. I wonder how you found studying the book of Ruth. I wonder if you've engaged with other things focused on the book of Ruth, not just our Rhythm for Life series, but if you've maybe read any books around Ruth or commentaries on Ruth or any reflections that other people have made on Ruth. As part of our preparation for this series, the staff have been reading a book by Mark Green about Ruth, and we've been looking at other resources, and I found it really wonderful to really get into a book in depth and to read lots around Ruth's character, the narrative, the context, and the meaning that the story of Ruth has for us. So I have found it really helpful. I wonder what you found helpful this month particularly. I wonder what has resonated with you most about Ruth's story, where you've been encouraged and challenged through her narrative, and where you've seen glimpses of God through the texts we've been engaging with. How have you found Ruth's story this last month? For me, I found encouragement through the whole book of Ruth. There's lots of encouragement I found through the different chapters of Ruth, through the different stages of her story. And what I have really loved is the way that God has given provision again and again and again. So there's the provision of family in Naomi and later on in Boaz. There's the provision of food in what is required of the Israelites so that Ruth and Naomi don't go hungry and other people like them don't go hungry. There is the provision of the kinsman redeemer so that children can be born to continue the line that Naomi is part of. The positive relationships that develop within that whole system and the wider family that grows because of what happens in the story. And the hope that this whole story alludes to, the hope of Jesus, the kinsman redeemer for all time, the God that knows and lives in the midst of our stories, that understands our struggles and comes alongside us in the midst of our everyday life to bring transformation, to bring new life, to give us a future and a family that we can belong to eternally. I wonder if there are other encouragements you have found through the story. For me, I found the book of Ruth to be challenging as well. I found that there have been lots of challenges in Ruth's story. And for me, the big ones are about living up to my responsibility. We've seen, haven't we, the responsibility of the Israelites throughout the story in different ways. And for me, there is the challenge of what does it mean for me to live as a Christian and to live up to the values that reflect God and my faith and being a Christian in this time of age, and also what it means for me to live responsibly as part of a global community, recognizing the intrinsic worth of every human being on this planet. How do I recognize the needs of others and be proactive in responding accordingly? And what does it mean to live out the justice and social aspects of the gospel every single day? How do my choices reflect the things I believe, the God I believe in, and reflect justice for those that need it? What challenges have you seen in the book of Ruth, and what takeaway are you going to be reflecting on as we go forward from this time? And for me, I've seen glimpses of God throughout this whole story. His fingertips are present, aren't they? Right from the beginning to the very end. And I read around last week or the week before that Ruth would have experienced the God that Naomi followed. So when her husband was alive, when Naomi's husband and her sons were alive, so Ruth's husband was alive, they would have been living as a family the Israelite life. They would have been following the Israelite God. And so Naomi would have been demonstrating what that means to Ruth, and Ruth would have seen it, would have seen this God that this family followed. And so in one sense, this God was attractive to Ruth because Ruth did not want to walk away from Naomi and Naomi's God. So there was this attractiveness of God. So we see that God is present right from the very beginning. And then we see God's fingerprints right the way throughout the story with the commands of the Israelites and the provision and the kinsman redeemer and the safety that Naomi and Ruth experience. That we don't hear them in masses of danger, and so there's this sense of God being over them and looking after them throughout the whole story. And the story ends, doesn't it, with this genealogy which ends with David, but we know that really it ends in Jesus. And so this narrative is part of the Jesus story, and it's a promise for the future, and God uses this story to bring about salvation for the whole world. And so God's fingerprints are all over this story, woven right the way through the whole midst of it. I wonder if there are places where you saw God that I haven't mentioned. How has God been speaking to you through this book? And we've come now, haven't we, to the very end of Ruth. We've come to this fourth chapter. We've seen that Boaz and Ruth get married, that they have a child, that this child is a blessing for them, a blessing for Naomi. And then we see that this child comes into the genealogy of David in that short little passage I read out. And not just in the genealogy of David, but this child, Obed, is in the genealogy of Jesus. This insignificant woman who's a stranger coming from a distant land, who isn't part of the Israelite family, suddenly becomes an ancestor to Jesus. She gets grafted into the family and becomes part of that story, part of the story that gives salvation to the whole world. And it got me thinking, what if you reflected on your life right now? We can sit here and we can look back on Ruth's life and we can see God at work through her story, and we can see the results of God being at work in her story. But if you reflected on your life, where would you see God's fingerprints now? If you looked back, where would you be able to identify where God had been at work and God had been making things possible, opening doors, closing doors, working through the situations that you face to bring you to where you are today? I find it's a really helpful exercise for us to take the time to look back and say, oh yes, I can see God was here and here and here. And it helps to build our faith and to encourage us and challenge us and to grow us when we look and see where God has been evident in our stories. And what I love about the story of Ruth is it's really a story about people, isn't it? It's about people impacting other people's lives. This group of almost disparate, disconnected people kind of coming together and meshing together, and the impact of that transforming all of their lives. Ruth on Naomi and Naomi on Ruth and Boaz and the Israelite community and Naomi and Boaz and then Boaz and Ruth and Obed, and it's this whole group of people and how their lives have had impacts not just on each other, because they do, but actually together have an impact on the future salvation of the world. And I think when you look back at your story, I wonder where you can see people that have impacted your life. I wonder where you can pinpoint people who have been transformational in your faith, in the person and the character that you've become, in where you are today. I wonder if you can identify people that have done that for you. And I wonder if you know how you might have been an impact on others' lives. I want to just read a story. This is a book called Don't Make History, Change the Future. It's a really good book. You could read it in a couple of hours, and I really recommend you do. It's by a guy called Matt Summerfield, and he is all about changing the future. But he tells this story. It was 1858, and a Boston Sunday school teacher named Kimball began visiting one of his students at a local shoe shop where the lad worked as a clerk. Through his faithful commitment, Kimball eventually had the privilege of leading the young boy to Christ. The young man's name was D.L. Moody. D.L. Moody grew up to become a powerful evangelist, and some 21 years later found himself in London leading a great spiritual awakening. A local London minister by the name of F.B. Mayer went along to hear Moody preach and was profoundly moved and affected by God's call on the man. Years later, Mayer found himself in the USA, where a young student by the name of J. Wilbur Chapman became a Christian at one of Mayer's meetings. Chapman became heavily involved in the YMCA, and during his time there, met and discipled a former baseball player called Billy Sunday. Billy Sunday became another great evangelist, and during one of his crusades in a small town called Charlotte, led many to Christ. The following year, the people who had found Christ at the Billy Sunday Crusades organized another crusade, inviting another eminent evangelist called Mordecai Ham to speak. Ham left the town 3 weeks later feeling discouraged due to the fact that only a handful of people had come to faith in Christ. But one of those new Christians was a teenage boy called Billy Graham, who went on to lead literally millions of people to Jesus all over the world. He goes on to say that the point of the story is ultimately not about Billy Graham. It's about an unknown school teacher called Kimball, who nearly 100 years earlier committed to invest in D.L. Moody. Just one boy, just one life. Because of Kimball, literally millions of people have come to know Jesus, because he invested in one boy, in one life, and the ripples of that have gone out from there. Ruth wouldn't have known that by going with Naomi, committing to following Naomi's God, sticking by Naomi's side, doing all the things Naomi asked her, marrying Boaz, would make her an ancestor of Jesus. She didn't know that. She didn't know what was going to come of her story. We know that because we can see the end. Kimball didn't know that he was going to be in the story of Billy Graham. We know that because we've seen the furtherness of the story. In the same way, if we are responsive to God, then God can work into our stories. He can work our situations, our choices, our actions together so that we too might make an impact on the world. And you know, it doesn't have to be big things that change the world. For Kimball, it was just committing to one boy. For Ruth, it was committing to her mother-in-law. And yet through both of those stories, amazing things have happened. We see that Ruth becomes an ancestor of Jesus, and Jesus brings salvation to the whole world. We see that Billy Graham becomes a Christian because years before, actions were taken that put events in motion that made it possible for him to hear the gospel. And so millions of people came to know Jesus through his ministry. What legacy do you want to leave? Ruth is a story of people impacting people. How do you want to be someone who impacts others? And what can you do today so that the legacy you leave behind is one that continues the faith that we follow, that continues people coming to recognize, know, and love Jesus as we do, and ultimately brings transformation to others' lives today, but also for generations to come? Maybe think about that challenge this week.